Hello, and welcome to this brand new Blender Smoothie tutorial. In this second part of the tree tutorial series, we're going to cover texturing and shading. And I kind of want to get right into this because I have a lot to cover, especially in the leaves. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to right-click the leaves to select them, press H to hide them, and we're just going to start with the tree trunk and the tree branches. So let me see if I can't. Okay. So with the tree trunk selected, remember we separated this from the rest of these branches in the last part, I'm going to go into edit mode. Now, the first thing we want to do is we want to UV map this. So basically we'll just project it onto the tree bark texture, and we'll go ahead and work a little bit with the shader to add a little more detail other than just the texture to hopefully make it look more realistic when we zoom in. Let me go ahead. Looks like I already had a couple seams there. I'm going to clear those. And basically, when you're UV mapping the tree trunk, you don't really have to worry that much about texture seams at first, unless you're doing a close-up. If you're doing a close-up of the tree, then you would want to make sure you fix any texture seams that are in there. But otherwise, it won't be noticeable at all, because the tree is so big compared to everything else, and we're going to scale down the texture to a pretty small size. So basically, I'm just going to Alt right-click an edge of the tree trunk, and you want to make sure it's a vertical edge, of course, so that it splits it vertically and not horizontally along one of the smaller rings. And I'm going to do that with the other two segment splits as well. I'll go up here where they're actually split, and I'm going to Alt right-click and Alt right-click. Whoops. Sorry, Alt Shift right-click. You want to hold down Alt Shift right-click on all of those to make sure that you're selecting multiple ones at once. So once all of those are selected, just press Ctrl E and click Mark Seam. And now when we unwrap this, it will pull apart the geometry around those areas that we just set up. So I'm going to press Tab to go back into object mode, just for now. I'll go up here in the upper right corner and split my viewport, and change the window on the right from 3D view to the image editor. I'm going to be using a bark texture that I got from CG Textures. You can see it here. If you just go to cgtextures.com, go to Wood, Tree Bark, and Deciduous in this case, since I am making a deciduous tree. And I think this is the texture I used right here. So that's a tiled texture, and it works really well for a lot of different trees, honestly, because you can even edit the colors a bit in Blender. So I'm going to be using that texture, and I'm just going to open it in the folder that I stored it in. Right here. Go ahead and bring that in. So the tree trunk and the tree branches aren't really going to take very long to set up. The bulk of this tutorial is going to be on the leaves. So once you've opened that, press Tab to go into edit mode again, A to select everything, and U to unwrap, and just click unwrap. And I'm just going to leave the scale the way it is right now so we can see how it looks. I'm going to split my viewport here and change this upper window to the node editor, and I'm going to add a new shader, and I'll name this trunk. And I'm naming it trunk and not just bark because the trunk shader is actually going to be set up differently from the tree branches. So let me move this out of the way. And to visualize this, all you have to do is press Shift-A, Texture, Image Texture, connect those two, and load the bark texture. I'm going to go ahead and hide the other branches, right-click them and press H to hide, just so we can focus on this specifically. And I'm going to go into Rendered View. And as we can see, the texture is mapped really terribly. It's way too huge, so it's really not showing up. A lot of the detail isn't showing up. It looks way out of scale. So I'm just going to go back into edit mode by pressing Tab, and I'm going to press S to scale this up. And I'm scaling up the mesh so that the actual texture shrinks in comparison. So maybe just something about like that, so that if we zoom in a little bit more, we'll see that it is getting a lot more realistic in size. But it still needs to be smaller than that. Maybe something like that will be realistic enough. Maybe a little, I'll scale that in a little bit more to make the texture a little bigger. Now, something you can typically do in this case, because if you take a look at it, it looks like it's mapped all right, but it looks kind of repetitive. You can see where the tiling occurs. So sometimes I like to add a little bit of color variation, maybe moss to try to hide that. So I might press Shift-A, add a mix shader, and I might mix this with maybe I'll just input an RGB value for this. And we'll go ahead and bring that up to green. I don't know if that's really doing anything. I think you can't plug, you have to plug a shader into the shader input, that's right. So I'm just going to add a diffuse shader instead and change the color of that. Just sort of a dark green, yellow kind of color. Something like that. And as the factor, I'm going to press Shift-A. I don't know how well you can see this. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I'm going to press Shift-A, and I'm going to add a noise texture and use that as the factor. And you can't really notice too much of a difference, so I'm going to add an RGB curves node between these two. And I'm just going to click and drag a couple points on here to bring up the contrast so you can really notice a difference there. Maybe I'll kind of move that over. And you just sort of tweak these points until you get something that you're happy with. Maybe something like that will work pretty well, I think. I'll move that back a little bit more. Tweak these. Alright, and then I'm also going to bring up the detail on this clouds texture, and I'm going to bring up the scale to about probably 25. Maybe 15 will work. Yeah, that'll work pretty well. I'll move that out a little bit, just so that we have a little more showing through there. And something like that. So that just helps give a little bit more color variation. If I go, this tree branch right here is really bothering me because it's sticking through. I'm going to kind of move that out of the way. Okay, that's better. Typically in this case, I would actually go ahead and, if the segment splitting was going to be visible, I might actually merge these trunks manually in edit mode. But I think in this case I'll leave it alone just because a lot of it's hidden by the branches. But if you were doing a more sparse tree, or if you were just doing a tree in winter where there weren't any leaves, then I would definitely advise that. So we have the bark shader set up, or the bark shader for the trunk set up. So now we have to set it up for the other branches. Oh, really quickly, actually, just remembered. Before we go ahead and do that, we still need to add bump mapping to this. I'm going to make this window a lot bigger, so hopefully you can actually see what's going on a little easier. Okay, so if we just plug this texture into the displacement input on the material output, and we take a look at this to see how it affects it, it's really strong. And of course, bark would be pretty noticeably bumpy in real life, but in this case, you start to get some sort of weird shadows on the side of the tree, and it doesn't look very good from a distance. So I'm going to press Shift-A and add Converter, Math node, connect that to the displacement input. I'm going to bring this down a little bit so I can zoom in a little more. And I'm going to connect the texture to the first input of this math node, and I'm going to change the type from add to multiply. And now when we edit this lower level, then it adjusts the amount of visible bump mapping. So if we set it to 0, there's no bump mapping. 1, there's a lot. You can go to values higher than 1. I don't know how significantly they affect it, though. I'm going to try 0.1 and see how that looks. So that if we zoom in, we can see that there is some really nice bump mapping occurring. And I think that helps with the realism quite a bit, even if it's not really that noticeable from a distance. So, alright, now I'm happy with the trunk shader. So I'm going to bring that up again, and I'm going to unhide the branches, Alt-H, and then re-hide the leaves. Maybe I'll just move them to another layer. Whoops. Alright. Yeah, I think I'm going to do that. Well, I'll just press H again, because we'll be bringing them back after this anyway. Now, there's not really an easy way to UV map the branches, because there are just so many of them, and they're all at different angles, so I found that really the most efficient way to go about doing this is to just use the generated texture coordinates and use a vector mapping node to control it a little more. So I'm going to bring down this window again, add a new shader, and we'll name this branches. And we'll start out the same way we did before. Press Shift-A, add texture, an image texture, connect those, and load the bark texture again. Except this time I'm going to press, and this is because Cycles, I believe, uses UV coordinates by default. I'm going to press Shift-A, go to Input, Texture Coordinate, and plug in Generated to the vector input on the image texture. So that now if we take a look, it's probably all going to be one color, just because we haven't actually set up the vector mapping yet. So let's go ahead and see. Yeah, it's not quite one color. It looks like it is trying to map it, but I think if we disconnected that, then it would all be one color. Yeah, now it's all one color. So I'll reconnect that, and I'm going to add a vector mapping node. Vector mapping. And I'll just put it right between those two. And the first thing we want to do is we want to increase the scale, because if you zoom in, you can really see that the texture is all blurry, and that's just because it's stretched really far across the entire mesh. So if we start off just by giving this a value of 20, 20, and 20, then you'll immediately see much better results. The scale is much more accurate. The problem is the direction of the bark doesn't really match most of the branches. Now, the way this method works, you're never going to be able to match the texture to the branches completely, but we can at least get it a little better by giving it some rotation along the z-axis, I believe. So 45, if we change that z rotation to 45 degrees, didn't really do much. Maybe it was the y-axis. Try rotating it along the y-axis 45 degrees. And that helps a little bit. Basically, we're just trying to get it a little more flat. Maybe if we do 90 degrees, just to make it completely horizontal. Again, it won't look quite right on some of the branches that are curving upward, but for the most part, that produces a pretty realistic branch texture. And I don't typically do bump mapping on these smaller branches just because they're so small that it's not really visible, and it just adds extra time to rendering and everything. So this is really all we have to do for the branch texture at this point. So I'm going to go ahead and press Z and save the file. And now we can finally get to the leaves, which will be the rest of this tutorial. And instead of working, I'm going to press Alt-H to unhide those. Instead of working on these leaves for the shaders, I'm going to start out by creating a leaf shader on another layer with separate planes, just because it's much faster to work that way. So I'm going to go to the second layer, and I already set up a light source in it, so we can go ahead and get started on it and see how it interacts with the lamp that we have on the other layer. So I'm going to press Shift-A and add a plane. And before I do anything else, we're going to have to set up the leaf textures in a photo editing program of some sort, or a paint program. Again, I downloaded my leaf texture, in this case from CG Textures. So if we just go to the home page here, if you go to Nature, Leaves, then there are plenty of different leaves available. To clarify, I believe the one I used was on the second page, if I can find it. Right here. I do not recommend downloading any texture other than the leaf with the transparent background, and this isn't really a very good example. If I can go ahead and go back to CG Textures and find something to illustrate this a little bit better. A lot of times, if you'll open up a leaf, let's try this one. No, not this one either. There are some leaves. Try this one. Well, there are some leaves that have a colored background. I think this was one of them. So basically, you'll see that there's the one with the transparent background, the one with the colored background, the alpha mask, and then the original photo that the leaf was cut out of. I do not recommend downloading the color map one with the colored background. We are going to be adding a colored background, but if you go ahead and do this, then it's harder to create the alpha mask. So I recommend that you just download the single leaf texture with the transparent background and create all the maps separately so you don't end up using a ton of your daily quota on CG Textures. In this case, I'm going to be using Photoshop. You can also do this in GIMP, probably Paint.net. All we're doing is filling in the background and basically cropping and resizing the image. So the first thing you want to do is you want to make the leaf texture square, because of course our leaves are square. So if the texture is a rectangle, then you're not going to be able to fit the whole leaf on, or it'll start overlapping on either side. So the first thing I typically do is I just select the leaf, Control-C to copy it, and I would just create a new file, typically 1000 by 1000 pixels, and I would just press Control-V and paste it. And then I can go in and sort of mess around with the scale and rotation of this. I typically place the leaves something like this, where the stem is touching the bottom of the image. If I remember correctly, this is the way you can set it up so that you don't actually have to rotate the UV coordinates of the leaf for the leaf stem to actually match up with the branches. So I'm going to basically place the leaf vertically like this so we can use it a little more easily, hopefully. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create the color map. So I'm just going to select my eyedropper tool, and I'm just going to sample a color just from somewhere along the leaf that I think really encapsulates the main color of the leaf. And I'm going to use the paint bucket and just fill the background. And I'm actually not really happy with this leaf's color, so I think I'm going to go up to Adjustments, Hue and Saturation. I'm going to bring up the saturation a little bit and edit the hue a bit more as well. Maybe edit the lightness a bit, just to get something a little more colorful. Alright, and then I'm going to adjust the background again as well. There we go. Okay, so I'm just going to save that as, and is this in the right? Yeah, this is in the right folder. I'm going to save it as a PNG file, and I'll just name it leaf color. Now, typically, and the way to produce more realistic trees in this case is to use multiple leaf textures and just assign them to different leaves, and I'll show you how to do that in just a second. In this case, I'm not going to prepare multiple leaf textures because that'll take a really long time and it'll be unnecessary. So once we're done with the color map, the next step is we'll create the translucency map next. Basically, the three different maps I want to create are color, translucency, and alpha. So basically the color map, of course, will just give us the color of the leaf. The alpha map will mask out the leaf so that we don't get the entire square texture. We just get the leaf shape, which is the reason we're adding this color, because there's typically a little bit of bleeding over, and we want to make sure that that color that bleeds over matches the leaf. And there's the translucency and bump map. And basically what the translucency and bump map does is it allows light to pass through the thinner parts of the leaf. So basically we're going to create a map where the veins are showing through a lot so that light doesn't pass through them as easily since they're thicker. So to do that, I'm just going to start out by painting the background black, a solid black. And I am going to select the first layer again, and I'm going to convert it. A little bit of this is kind of out of view of the recording, but I'm going up to Image, Adjustments, Black and White. And basically all we're trying to do, if I turn off preview, we can see that the veins are more yellow and the rest of the leaf is more green. All we're trying to do is create a lot of contrast between the two. So if we go to preview, and if I really dropped the yellows and really brought up the greens, we get something like that. And you might want to mess around with inverting those colors, just because you can use it either way, just by changing the values in Blender. In this case, I think the green and yellow will work fine, so I'm going to click OK. And then I'm going to go to Brightness and Contrast, and I'm going to increase the contrast. And I might do that a couple times. Image, Adjustments, Brightness and Contrast. Bring up the contrast again. Maybe lower the brightness. I'll keep it at something like that. And then the only other thing I want to do is go to Image, Adjustments, and Invert. And I'm just going to go ahead and do that in Photoshop to save myself the time of doing that in Blender. So I'm going to go ahead and save this image as leaf translucency. And finally, all we have left to do is the alpha mask. And this is just the easiest part, because in this case, you can just go ahead and lock the transparent pixels and change the color to white, increase your brush size, and basically just paint all over it. So that's fairly easy to do. If the program that you're using to edit the image doesn't have an option to lock the transparent pixels, you should still be able to open it as two different layers. And if that's the case, you can just paint the back layer one color, and probably use the paint bucket for the first layer, because I think that should work pretty well. If you lower the tolerance since the rest of the image surrounding it is transparent, that should work pretty well. So I'm going to go ahead and close this because we don't need... Oh, actually, I didn't save this. I'm going to save this first and then close it. This will be leaf alpha. And now I'll go ahead and close it, and I don't need to save this because we have the images. We're not going to be creating any more maps. So I'm going to close this. And now we can go ahead and start opening some of these in Blender. So I'm going to open... that's the right one, I believe. Double check. Yep. I'll just open the leaf color to begin with, so we can see how that looks. And this should be pretty easy to translate to the leaves on the actual tree. So I'm going to press Tab to go into Edit Mode, U to unwrap, and in this case I'm just going to project it from view. In the case of the leaves, we aren't actually going to have to unwrap it because the leaves are already unwrapped. We'll just have to adjust the size and rotation. So I'm going to press Tab to go back into Object Mode, now that we've set that up. And I'm going to go to the Node Editor, and we'll create a new shader and call this Leaf. And I'm going to try to make a lot of room for this, just so we can really see what we're doing. So the first thing I want to do is I want to work on the top of the leaf. I'm going to start by working on the top of the leaf, then the bottom of the leaf, and then we'll mask it out. And then probably add some bump mapping too. So when you look at the top of a leaf, I think the best way to represent that in a leaf shader is to mix a diffuse shader and a subsurface scattering shader, along with a little bit of glossiness. So to start with, just to make sure this mapped properly, I'm going to press Shift-A, Texture, Image Texture, connect those, and I'm going to load the leaf color texture just to make sure that this loaded properly. So we'll see, and it looks like it did. It looks just fine. Okay. So now that we know that worked out well, then I'm going to press Shift-A and add a subsurface scattering shader. And I think I'm already set for the experimental feature set. By default, though, I think Blender is set to supported over here in the render settings under feature set, so that when you add a subsurface scattering node, you'll get this warning that says only enabled an experimental GPU kernel. Which, of course, also would probably be different if you're not using your GPU. But in this case, since we do want to be able to use the GPU, then all we have to do is come over here and change the feature set from supported to experimental. Again, I don't know if that affects it if you're using the CPU. Let me check and see. Yeah, I don't think it has to be set to experimental if you're using the CPU and not the GPU. But if you are, then change this feature set to experimental or it won't show up properly. And with that selected, I'm going to connect the image texture to that. And I'm just going to add a mix shader and combine those two. So at this point, we can go ahead and save that and maybe take a look at this. And I'm going to want to come over here and probably mess with the sampling a little bit, maybe give it 25 preview samples. And we're not really going to be able to see anything at this point yet, just because we haven't added glossiness or bump mapping or anything else. Let's add a little bit of displacement so it shows up a little better. So I'm going to press Tab to go into Edit Mode, W, Subdivide, and over here on the left, I'm going to bring up the number of cuts to, let's say 3, and then I'm going to scroll down and also bring up the fractal value to give this a lot more displacement. Something like that. And then press Tab to go back into Object Mode, bring that back down, set the shading to smooth, and I'm going to add a subsurf modifier too. So let's go ahead and render that again and see how that looks. Okay. It does look a little strange, of course, but part of that is because we haven't keyed out the leaf yet, so the background is still there. I think I'm just going to leave the preview on while I'm working with this from here on out. I also like to add a little bit of texture blurring, 0.25 maybe. I think that gives it a bit of a smoother look. With that done, I don't think I'm going to edit the mix shader at all. I think that's a factor of 0.5 works pretty well. So the only other thing I'm going to do with the surface of the leaf now is I'm going to give it some glossiness. So I'm going to move these out of the way. And I'm going to add another mix shader. And I'm going to mix that with a glossy shader. And I think I've found that the best value for these glossy shaders is, we'll try a roughness of like 0.1 and a factor of 0.005. And that seems really tiny, and you might be rotating this for a really long time trying to figure out why that value is so small, because it looks like it's not being affected at all. But once we start adding the bump mapping, oh, and as you can see there, it looks like it's starting to come through a little bit. Yeah, it may be difficult to see in the preview, but I think that really is a good value for the glossiness. If I put it any higher than that, then a lot of times it'll look like some of the leaves are wet on the tree. But in this case, that's not what I'm intending to do. With that set up, let's go ahead and work on the bottom of the leaf. So again, this is just the top of the leaf. If we look at the other side, it looks terrible. You expect a lot more light to be filtering through than that. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to kind of move these out of the way. And to begin with, for the underside of the leaf, I'm just going to start by adding a mix shader. Or I'm going to add an add shader instead, is what I meant to say. And the reason I'm doing this is because if I add a translucent shader after this and connect it to the second input there, all I did was add a translucent shader and connect it, and then connect the image texture to that translucent shader. So if I set this to let's say a mix shader, and we take a look at this, and oops, sort of plug that into the output there, you'll see that there is more light coming through on the back, but there's still not a whole lot, and now the top is much darker as a result. So you typically want to use an add shader, just because that doesn't mess with the top of the leaf, and it allows more light to pass through the underside. So again, this is from the top view with the add shader. It looks the same as it did before, and the underside is also casting a lot of light, or letting a lot of light filter through. So the next thing we want to do is we want to use that translucency texture that we set up, because at this point light is just filtering through it evenly. There's no distribution, specific distribution, I should say. So I'm going to go ahead and basically what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this image, I'm going to make it darker and use that darker version of the image to mix with the lighter version, using that translucency texture as the factor. So I'm going to add a color, brightness, and contrast node. And I'm just going to preview this through the translucent node. I'm going to make this -0.3, make this -0.6. When you're lightening or darkening a texture, it's often best to keep the contrast at approximately double the brightness. And I might try more than that, -0.45, -0.9, something like that. So that if I go ahead and I add I believe mix RGB is what I was planning on adding, and mix that with the original texture, and if I load another image texture and open the translucency image, wait a second, because for some reason it always takes a little while to open some of these images, and if I plug that translucency texture, whoops, that's not what I meant to do, connect that. If I plug that translucency texture into the factor, and of course I did it backwards, so I need to flip that around. There we go. Then we'll see that light is not filtering through the veins nearly as much as it is through the rest of the leaf. It looks kind of strange at first, but I think it does add a lot more realism to the leaves when light isn't just filtering through evenly like that. So at this point, I think the next thing I would like to do is we'll go ahead and take care of the masking. So I am going to add a shader, mix shader there, mix our current shader with a transparent shader. Oops, connect those. So I just added a mix shader and mixed the transparent with the current, make sure that's all the way bright. And I'm going to add another image texture, and of course this time I will load the leaf alpha. And, I probably set those up backwards too. I guess we'll find out. Yep. Okay, so flip those two inputs. Plug that right there into the lower input instead. And there we go. Now they should be masked evenly. So at this point, really the only thing left we have to do with this leaf shader is, I guess, give it a little bit of bump mapping. And I think in this case, I'm just going to use the color texture for the bump mapping. So I'm just going to take our original image texture, the color texture, and plug that into this math node that I added. Change the value from add to multiply. And I'm going to lower this value to 0.05, and we'll see how that looks. I'm actually going to bring that up to 1, just because I kind of want to see what direction the bump mapping is being applied in. So it looks upside down. I'm going to try -1, because the leaf or the vein should sort of bulge out a little bit more on the back than it does in the front. Something like that, I think. Yeah. Okay. So we'll do -0.05 instead of 0.05. And again, it's a really subtle bump mapping, but maybe if I can get it sort of in the light a little bit. There we go. When the glossiness starts to affect it, it looks much more realistic. I might actually come over here to the glossiness, and I'm going to lower the roughness to 0.1 to make that specularity a little more visible. And that's it for the leaf shader. So at this point, all we have to do is move that up out of the way. Actually, I'm going to merge those windows and then merge that with the UV image editor for now. And I'm going to come back to our first layer here. And we'll go ahead and select the leaves. And actually, we do need the UV image editor, because we have to make sure that the UVs are set up properly with these leaves. So I'm just going to load the leaf color texture again. And I'm going to press Tab to go into edit mode. And as you can see, they've already been UV mapped. We just have to edit the scale a little bit. And it might be kind of unresponsive just because there are so many leaves. Maybe scale that along the y-axis a little bit. Okay, let me try. I'm going to try going into edit mode. I'm also going to hide these branches in the tree trunk, just to see if that'll help speed up the viewport a little bit more. And I'll press Shift Space to make this full screen, maybe. And that should work. So Shift Space again to make that back to its original size. And now all we have to do is head up to the material options here and select the leaf shader. So now our leaf shader should be applied. I'm going to go ahead and save this to the tree. Let me go ahead and merge all these windows. I want to do a basic test render just to make sure. Something that you'll want to do when working with these leaves, I would like to add, is that you do want to edit some of the light paths, or the sampling down here in the light paths. This is in the render settings under the light paths tab. I typically bring up the transparency bounces from 8 to 24. Let's see here. Oops, 24. And the max bounces from 12 to 24, and the transmission bounces from 12 to 24. And this produces a much more realistic result, just because sometimes the light doesn't seem to bounce enough times amongst the different leaves, so you get really, really dark patches that don't look very realistic. So bringing up those bounces really helps with that. And I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to make this much smaller, maybe 35% of that. And I think I'm just going to start off by rendering a small segment of this so that I can use more samples. And I'm going to try, we'll start with 50 samples just to see how that looks. Alright, so this is the result. As you can see, the leaf shader applied properly. And I don't know how easily you can see this. I'll zoom in to see if I can make that more noticeable. But the leaves are connected in the right spot to the branches, so they're not sticking on sideways somehow, as I see a lot of times in trees created in sapling. The trick to that is just getting the rotation of the texture correct. So it looks like they are rotated correctly, and everything else looks pretty good. I mean, the bark texture on the tree branch looks a little bit off in this case, but for the most part, everything seems to be working out just fine. I don't think we need to tweak anything else in the leaf shader, so I'm going to leave that as it is for now. And I think that's going to be it for this tutorial. So we covered the tree trunk and the branches and the leaves, and now that we have everything modeled and everything textured and shaded, the next step in the next tutorial is going to be final touches. And I believe the biggest thing that I'm going to go over in that part of the tutorial is applying gravity to the leaves so that they actually droop like they do in real life, instead of sticking out at those annoying angles, and it just doesn't look as realistic that way. So I will warn you that the technique to doing that is very processor intensive, or at least very RAM intensive. So it may take a pretty long time to get it to set up, but the results look much more realistic once it's finished. So that's it for this part of the tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something from it, and I'll see you on the next one.